Yeah, do you want me to start about why? Well, I will admit that I had heard about Louise Brigham a few years ago when I met Antoinette at an artist residency. We were both at the Vermont Studio Center, and Antoinette was at the beginning, I want to say, of really did a lot of research, and I think we're thinking through, this life of a woman who really wasn't as well known as she should have been, and one of the things I love about Antoinette's work, of course, is that she understands the power of an archive and the capacity to unearth within this trove of historic documents stories from people who are underrepresented in the larger cultural narrative. And while Louise Brigham was quite well known in her time, she was forgotten for a number of reasons that I think Antoinette can elaborate on. And I was so fascinated with her, and I was really, really taken with this idea that there was this moment of isolation on this very remote island that helped to coalesce for her a lot of work that she had already done. And I think she had this big breakthrough when she was there, as Antoinette describes so eloquently in her book. And so I felt like she was the kind of person who, while a century old, was really speaking again now in her ethos and her design. And I felt that there was so much about Louise Brigham that felt very contemporary.
So Antoinette, what about the materials? Your biography, your statements and everything online, I found interesting. You said you're actually discontent with materiality itself. So can you talk a little bit about how you interface with Louise's love of a certain kind of material, how she came across this material? People who don't have the background into her design ethos will appreciate that background.
So my relationship to materiality has two aspects. One is that I am never as comfortable with artist materials as other artists, but I'm very comfortable with working digitally, like with stylus-based drawing and things like that. The other aspect of it is that there's been so much hype around digital technologies and virtuality since I first got into computers in the early 90s that I have a lot of aversion training on that front, about people overselling all the utopias that are supposed to come our way. But so my connection to Brigham is on the side of invention. I'm very interested in things that come out of unexpected corners, and also things that reappear that people thought were done with, that obsolete technologies, neglected technologies. That quality of reinvention really interests me. And of course, I have worked with wood myself, so it is a material I like very much. But what really struck me about her experiments in 1906 or so in the remote island of Svalbard is that she decided that packing crates were not just something you'd slap together to make a crappy little stool, which is what people have been doing with packing crates for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Well, not packing crates, but scrap wood. Packing crates were a relatively new invention in the early 20th century. But she decided she was going to make high design with this utterly shoddy material. And that quality of imagination was, I think, the thing that really grabbed me.
And so the packing crates themselves, I know you elaborated with me a little bit about where those were being used and how they were being used in urban situations as well. So I'd like to try to connect from the island of Svalbard, 500 miles away from any Norwegian port, her inspiration there, and how that might have led her to see scrap material differently in the environment where she spent most of her time working with immigrants and young men who were learning carpentry skills basically from her.
So a little background, since I'm assuming a lot of people here haven't read the book yet. She was born around 1875 or so and was a young woman in the early 20th century in an era when women were not normally trained in carpentry. It was still a gendered expectation that you taught girls to do things like sewing and knitting, and they were going to go on and run a household one day. So, but she did have managed to get a little bit of training in carpentry. She went to art school briefly. She got some basic skills, and she was already interested in experimenting when she spent 2 summers on the island of Svalbard in a coal mining camp that was managed by a friend of her family's. But what she was doing out there, you know, a young Bostonian in 1906, as Carrie was saying, above the Arctic Circle, in a place where I think there were probably only 2 women on the island at that particular time, herself and the wife of the manager. There was a kind of starkness to that I think inspired her to think about what she could do with these packing crates. They couldn't be really thrown away. There was nowhere to throw them away. There, you know, you could make a dump site of them, but it was literally an advanced camp with a couple of wooden buildings and a lot of tents. They later developed into a city, but not for many years afterwards. So there she is with these packing crates, which themselves were relatively new. It was really only in the early 20th century that companies started standardizing packing materials into basic box types. And so in a way, they may have even caught her eye because of their novelty within the culture as a whole, standardized packing crates. I don't know for sure how standardized the crates on Svalbard were. I just know that there were a lot of crates that had been used to bring in the food, and that she disassembled these and made a good deal of furniture out of them. And the furniture in the photos from Svalbard, those 2 summers, those what I call transformative summers, looks pretty well made. And although I think she went on and developed and refined her designs a good deal between 1906 and 1909, which is when she published her own book about how to make a furniture out of recycled boxes, a kind of book for the masses, which I happen to have a copy of.
Oh, wow.
It not being a particularly valuable, it's not a valuable book. So I have my own copy, and it's very simply furnished, very simply illustrated with line drawings and instructions and a description of how to build the box. And it tells you which boxes to use, like a soap box or a silk box or a butter box or a bean box. And at the beginning, she has a list of the basic carpentry tools you would need. And there are a few illustrations by an illustrator named Asherman, who was a designer in his own right, showing what rooms would look like that were completely furnished with recycled packing crate furniture. So
quite an extensive
something
book.
About perhaps just this. Yeah, no, it is. It's 100. She neatly set it up to be 100 designs. It's exactly 100 designs. She made others. I have come across in some of the articles she later wrote other designs that weren't in this book. It went through several editions. It was translated into several languages. She organized she was a very organized person, I think. She organized the book by increasing complexity of the things being made, as well as by the type of room that the furniture was being designated for. So she had furniture designated for every room in the house, except the bathroom, because people in that period did not mostly have indoor bathrooms. They had
shared or outdoor.
What are those things called? You stick on a bedpan, like that. So I don't know if that answers your question.
It does, but I'm wondering. It does, but I jump quickly to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth, what do you make of the designs themselves, since you are an architecture critic and you've seen a lot of this?
Well, you know, for me, it might help to contextualize.
We lost Elizabeth.
I've lost
Am I
Elizabeth
here?
too.
Sorry, did I?
You're back. You're back.
Am I back? I'm so sorry, everybody. I think my internet is all right. So I was saying that, you know, I went into writing about architecture and design because I was really interested in the way that what we build influences who we are. This reality that we're different people in different places, right? That the human-made environment has a way of affecting us. And you can think about how when you walk into one room, you feel a certain way, you walk into another, you feel differently. Why is it that one city calls to you when another doesn't? And I think that one of the things that really struck me about Brigham, in addition to her aesthetic at the time, which had as Antoinette talks about very well in her book, at a time when like the Victorian interior, the very robust and rich and, you know, quite fanciful, fancy and heavy Victorian interior design was sort of more of the norm. She was coming out with stuff that was very modern, right? It was very rectilinear. It was very clean. It was modular in a lot of ways, and it could be adjusted for multiple functions. You know, from a design perspective, her ability to think about how one piece of furniture could solve multiple problems is really extraordinary, particularly when you think about her audience, because Louise's audience was not the wealthy and the well-to-do. Louise's audience was the middle class or the working class. It was immigrants. It was people who needed to get a lot out of a little. And she thought about small places and shared spaces and how a desk might also be a dining table or include a bookshelf. So just from a design standard, I think you would look at many of her designs or even the finished pieces and think that they could be in an IKEA catalog today or, you know, sold at, you know, any kind of modern design store. But I think that what really strikes me as someone who thinks about architecture as a whole is also that she really thought about how people live with what is designed. She thought a lot about the real life of people and what furniture and aesthetic and design offered them. And she really wanted them to have power over the design of their space, particularly people who didn't have that kind of power at the time.
So that idea of...
Yeah, that's really true.
Go ahead. Sorry, there was a lag. Go ahead, Antoinette.
I was just going to say that's really true what Elizabeth says, and I can't emphasize how much she invested in multifunctional furniture, which was not the norm, and modular furniture, which you could rearrange in various ways to make an apartment more livable. And she also was interested in things like cushions and curtains that would actually make it comfortable to sit on the furniture, which was not necessarily something all modern designers thought about at the time. Designers who had very rectilinear aesthetics didn't always think about how you actually sat on their furniture.
Antoinette, could you talk a little bit more about her brief experience in Europe studying with Joseph Hoffman at the Wiener Werkstätte? Because those ideas about fabric and luxury, adding design as an element to the new modern, but without it having to be overwrought kind of design that was, you know, from the Baroque to the neoclassical stuff that is all over Vienna. How do you think that influenced her? How much information did you find about that? That's a personal interest of mine and also DoppelHouse Press, but just maybe that's a link to getting back to the settlement movement in the United States.
So I need to preface this by saying that one of the issues with Brigham is that there's very little firsthand documentation of her life for various reasons. So what we know about what she thought about what she was doing comes mostly from her published materials. Private correspondence, private archives, they seem not to have survived. So one of the periods about which I have less information is the 5 years that she spent going, I think probably to and from Europe, studying with artisans and designers all around Europe. The most important of whom was Hoffmann, Joseph Hoffmann, the wonderful Viennese designer. She took from him her commitment, a commitment to the idea of the square, the rectilinearity that comes directly from Hoffmann, whom she considered her design mentor. I think she was influenced in part by that holistic approach that the Viennese designers took. You designed for an entire living space. So they looked at things like wallpaper, cushions, linens, hangings, kind of everything to create this aura within which one lived both physically and mentally, culture, sort of a spiritual space for the person. And I think that influenced to some extent her own holistic approach to designing every necessary piece for an apartment and thinking about how they all worked together. She also visited people like Charles Rennie Mackintosh in Scotland, and she spent a good deal of time in Scandinavia, where I suspect she picked up a lot of ideas about education. The Scandinavian countries at that time were thinking hard about what they called sløjd, which is an idea of education that is based on around handcrafts, around teaching through manual doing of various kinds. And it was in Scandinavia, also in Copenhagen, that that's one of the places she got involved with the settlement movement as well.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the settlement movement, because I think this is an area that the two of you will have a conversation that brings us back to America a little bit. And it's so interesting that Louise Brigham at her age and being a woman and being an American was so interested in what's happening in the rest of the world and kind of importing it back. But there was such a relationship to politics in these movements that I think that's something maybe people aren't aware of when you look at design, when you look at modern design, that it's full of these sometimes socialist, communitarian ideas that are kind of embedded in how these designs developed. People see Sunset Magazine and they go to IKEA and they sort of assume that this is divorced of politics because of how it is. It sits commercially and within our culture. But I've said enough. I'll pass the mic.
Yeah, and Antoinette, you should absolutely jump in here as well, because you know probably far more about the specifics of Brigham's work, and the timeline. But the settlement house movement was really, and Antoinette, correct me if I'm wrong, this moment where there was a recognition that with the influx of immigration into America, there was this gap in this capacity of access, both to quality living. There were tenement houses and houses that just were overcrowded and overrun. And the idea of the settlement house was to create this kind of mixed use place where individuals from different cultural and socioeconomic classes could live together. And many of them, they were in Chicago. There was a big one in Chicago, and I believe that Brigham worked in Cleveland, right, Antoinette, at the Sunshine Cottage there. And the idea was that you had more than just a living space. It was also a place where there might be a school, an education. There might be other opportunities to learn in ways. And it was this idea of trying to intermingle individuals that might not normally live in proximity to one another and create an environment that might support the integration of immigrants and also celebrate their culture while supporting the needs of them in a new country. And Brigham actually lived with a young family in the Sunshine Cottage and started developing some of her furniture ideas there, right? This was before she went to Europe, correct?
Yeah, right before she went to Europe, she made some experiments. She had trained both in art and in education a little bit. She worked in a kindergarten teaching in New York. So she was always interested in education, and she was very much a classic progressive era practical idealist. And I think that she was very attracted to this idea of living with and not just, I mean, a lot of the amelioration efforts, the sort of philanthropic efforts of the late 19th century were led by women of means. They were expected to help those who were deserving and less well off, and it was part of that idea that women were the moral standard bearers of the culture, kind of a heavy burden for women to bear. But that idea that not helping downwards but helping across is, I think, one of the things that also appeals to me about Brigham. Working in the settlement houses, which is our kind of a co-housing where education and how you lived with your neighbors, and your neighbors were immigrants. And that made it very real in a way that wasn't the norm for how philanthropy happened. There were about 100 settlement houses by the time the era fizzled out in the Great Depression. So there weren't a huge number in America, but they were all this radical social experiment in how you live in a city across class, across language barriers, across all kinds of divides. And so that idea of living with was something she also later took with her away from the settlement movement when she moved back to New York. Around the time she wrote her book, she was living in the Upper East Side, which we now think of as super wealthy Manhattan, but at the time was a tenement area of Manhattan. And she lived there with the people she worked with and furnished her own apartment entirely with box furniture to underline in the most emphatic possible way that this wasn't just something for other people. It was the real deal, and that was where she also started the carpentry workshops for at first for young boys, to give them skills, knowledge, and the ability to make their own furniture. And the more I think about, the more I think that the settlement house ethos really permeated her later vision, even though she didn't stay inside the movement for very long.
Well, and what always struck me about it as well is that, her book with those 100 designs, she was someone who was designing not for her own sort of star power. She wasn't thinking about selling a piece or two or creating a body of work. She was really designing for, today we call human-centered design, right? Like, she was really designing for real people, and she wanted real people to take this and use her designs. And so I really feel like in that way, sometimes she was thinking less as a designer per se, and more as this, sort of educator and enabler, and as someone who was going to disseminate something that other people could take and use in their own lives. And that definitely, that settlement house ethos carried through in how she thought about her design.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about this exactly this way until right now, but we would call this maybe today something like a Creative Commons or Public Commons project, because while the book itself is copyrighted, she was perfectly happy to have anyone make her designs. She trained the boys in the workshop on her designs, but she was also happy if they wanted to make other designs or make their own designs. She was not trying to make money out of the design angle of this at all. So we know she survived the flu because she was alive for several decades thereafter, although her life changed very much after the war, after about 1920, for a number of different reasons. But what that really made me think of was the fact, again, the thing that I mentioned briefly earlier, that so little of her private information journals survives that I don't actually know what that moment meant to her. It was obviously a extraordinary moment, the 1918-19 pandemic. She married relatively late in life for her generation, when she was in her 40s, and her husband lived for they were married for only 4 years until he died. He was a generation older. He died in 1920. At that point, her career was kind of over. The design world and the world in general had somehow culturally moved on. She went on and did other things, but she never had any of her own children, and her family seems never to have passed any whatever documents, letters, memoirs, journals, photographs there were, got lost to time, which is often the case with these obscure figures. We know that she started a memoir. There's indications in the record, and it's been lost. So it's very frustrating, because there's so many things in her life I would like to know more about, and I just don't have access to her mind. She was very polished at the public Louise Brigham that was putting these ideas before the public, giving dozens of newspaper interviews, writing her own articles. She wrote quite a lot, especially for Ladies' Home Journal. There's just so little that gives you the person behind the career. It's extremely frustrating. And I was thinking, yeah, that's one of the moments I really wanted to know about when I was researching her life. What was the war like for her? What was 1918 like for her? Yep. It's probably gone.
She was in New York at that time. And she
was in New York and pretty much until around 1920. And then the traces of her become very hard to find for a while. Later in life, by the 30s, she has taken up a completely new kind of identity, if you will. She becomes involved with the psychic healer Edgar Cayce, who's very well known to people who are interested in such matters. He has set up a hospital complex in Virginia, in Virginia Beach, South Carolina. I've read an entire biography of him, trying to understand what her connection was to him. He was a gifted natural diagnostician, but he also gave psychic readings, and she had a number of psychic readings with him, and the transcripts of those readings are available through the foundation that supports that resulted from Casey's work. And so there's a little bit of personal insight that comes from those readings very, very late in life, in the 40s and 50s. She died in 1956. So the last 20 years of her life are extremely obscure.
You've got to tell us at least one psychic reading.
Oh, this is great, actually. I didn't emphasize this a lot in the book because it wasn't really the focus of the book, but it's certainly an interesting, and it's very American in a way. Her idealism turned from the pragmatics of the design, the furniture design, to kind of spiritual self-questing, right, and spiritual growth. The readings that Casey did for her apparently revealed that she had had a number of past lives. I gather this was fairly common with Casey's readings. And one of her past lives was apparently as a woman who was present at the birth of Christ and held the newborn Jesus shortly after he was born. And she was really into this idea and would take part in Christmas pageants, all dressed up as if she were kind of in the nativity. So who knows? You can call it questing, you can call it dementia, you can call it whatever you want. You can call it a love of theatricality that never expressed itself earlier in her life. I don't know what it is, but I sort of love the fact that she had this past life. And in fact, you run into these extremely weird byways whenever you do a research project like this. I discovered along the way that somebody connected with the Casey organization and the psychic research folks wrote a novel, a commercial novel. You can actually still find it online, about 3 women, and the author based it on some of these past life readings. And one of the women in this novel is based on the Louise Brigham past life.
Wow.
So she had an afterlife as a fictional character in a novel under a completely disguised name. So
does this
there's
make
always something you just don't expect.
Is this a Wikipedia profile, Antoinette?
No, I have a chapter in her book about her later life, mostly because I found some very interesting self-reflection in that chapter about what the nature of her life had been. She was clearly somewhat disappointed that her work hadn't taken off more. She wondered whether she should have gone down a slightly different path. There's a lot of the most revealing self-questioning that I found in any Brigham documents is actually in the psychic readings. So that I did decide it was worth a chapter to look at what she was thinking about her life at the very end of her life, or towards the end of her life, when she ended up with health issues, and one of the things she went to Casey for was healing, and apparently he did help her with her health. He tended to give very sensible medical advice. That was one of the things I discovered reading about him.
One of the things
that's a long way away from the subject.
Well, I was going to say though, and obviously we don't know, because we don't know much of her interior monologue from her direct entries, but it seems that Louise was quite a sensitive soul in that she really felt the environment. She really understood and felt the built environment. She really understood the value of aesthetic, perhaps not from a sort of statue or stature kind of a way, but really from a quality of life kind of a way. The idea that in many ways, I think that Louise sort of intuited what we're understanding now, that we scientifically understand more about what goes on in the brain and the body and the way place and built environment informs us. Like, we understand a lot more now about the literal ways in which our surroundings inform not only our brains, but our bodies, our emotional states. And it seems like Louise intuited some of that as she was thinking about that holistic design approach, the way that you needed to have a curtain and you needed to have a textile with the right feel, and you needed to have a home that represented the way you really lived. And it wasn't about, putting on a show or keeping up with the Joneses. It was really about sort of being your essential self. And I realize I'm reading a little bit into Louise's intention right now, but as you sort of follow that sensitivity over her life, it doesn't surprise me that she was trying to, understand what was going on from a psychic, because she always was sort of very attuned to the emotional state of a room or a place.
And how does that relate to the politics of the time?
Yeah,
Sorry, I'm always jumping in here. It's delay. I'm wondering how that relates to the politics of the time, Elizabeth. How that might track with the affection or disaffection of the general American public toward things like thrift or insulation, or broadly bringing more people together, in which you would need a home to entertain, and a kind of idea post-war that's very strong. That you need a display space and things are much more open. But her designs seem very personal, and that these are places you keep your personal things and your personal self, and you contain in their boxes. So I don't know if we can talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I think that what was interesting about her that struck me again is that she really did very much have the individual in mind in terms of what was best for the individual and what they needed. But then at the same time, she really did create this showcase in her apartment in New York to show that it could be elegant, that it could be design worthy, and that she was writing for some of the women's magazines at the time, like Ladies' Home Journal, really sort of, I guess, making the case for her furniture and making the case for the fact that you could feasibly design a whole room. But I don't know that the women who were reading Ladies' Home Journal were necessarily her audience. And Antoinette, you can correct me if I'm wrong here. that she was really thinking about those that didn't have the access. And the other thing that really strikes me about Louise is that, you know, we have this hierarchy when it comes to architecture, and oftentimes architecture with a capital A and design with a capital D is for the rarefied class that can afford the designer, that can afford the architect, that can hire the consultant. And what strikes me about Louise is that she was a person who created her client base that didn't know that they existed as a client, if that makes sense. That even today, one of the big conundrums right now in architecture, as you know, we're having these protests across the country, as we're really understanding not just the way like systemic policing issues and other policies have created a very racist and unfair environment, you know, you're starting to also understand the politics of space and the way that space has been designed for some and not for others. And one of the arguments right now in the architecture field is, where should architects put their energies? Should they, for instance, agree to design a prison? Should they agree to participate in Trump's border wall? Should they design, you know, Zaha Hadid's stadium in Dubai for the World Cup where migrant workers were dying building it? And what you often hear is there's an ethical and a moral question, but then even when you start looking at designing for those who can't afford a designer, it always comes back to the question of like, well, who's the client? It's a client-based profession that kind of relies on having patronage, someone to pay for the service and then respond to that need. And I think what was interesting about Louise is that she functioned outside of that whole milieu. Like she was able to kind of create her own work for a client base that couldn't afford her, but then could take the benefit of what she had designed. I don't know if that answered your original question.
You know, it brings up a new path here. It was to start talking about, oh, we lost Antoinette for a second, but hopefully she can still hear us. To talk a little bit about how Louise is a precursor to things like the DIY movement and permaculture workshops and all these things that are out there now because of the internet, that are really based around people sharing information to make their lives better. And you can do it with whatever materials you have at hand, wherever you happen to be, whether you're a renter. Friends in Australia are doing permaculture for renters, which I love, because it's like, what can you do with a house that is not yours and a garden that's not yours? And they have some pretty unique things you can do to create a gray water system and all these other things without necessarily okaying it with your landlord. Just, that's interesting, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the great things about Antoinette's book is that it really does this great job of showing how Louise really informed either directly, here she's back. Hi.
Hi.
Antoinette, we're talking about the way in which Louise really was a precursor and kind of presaged a lot of things that were coming later. You know, here was someone who, when she started to, when she got back to New York, she created a business where she was flat packing her furniture and shipping it so that people could assemble it at home. So she was not only teaching people how to make it on their own, but she was basically coming up with, you know, the modular flat pack system before that was widely acknowledged or discussed. She was definitely thinking about sustainability and thrift in a way where most people were using old boxes to burn for firewood. They weren't thinking that they could be much of anything other than maybe heat. And so a lot of what she started to think about as a whole system and ethos for her furniture was so advanced at the time. And now we can see a lot of that in the way we do business now. Did I just see a cattail?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I wanted to touch on the idea of thrift, because I think, Elizabeth, you express it so nicely and clearly, but people were always being told to be thrifty. The upper and middle classes were always telling people below them to be thrifty in this period. It was a sort of, again, a moral duty that was being imposed on people. And the thing that distinguishes Brigham in part was her belief that this could be beautiful. And she cared very much that the work she was making was beautiful and that people would live with beauty. And I think it's worth remembering in that context that although she was, as an adult, she owed the most aesthetically to Hoffman, she was trained as a young artist in the 1890s by people who come from the arts and crafts era, which has, again, this a strong belief that beauty is part of a good life and that handmade objects are important. There's a strong anti-industrialization quality to the arts and crafts ethos. So I think she imbibed that anti-industrial quality early on as well, and then turned this idea of thrift towards beauty. All of her writing, she's constantly commenting on the importance of the beautiful in the work, in the living, in what you're trying to live with as a human being. So yeah, you're right. There's a very human-centered aspect to what she's doing as a designer. I think I missed part of what you said, so I may not have picked up on everything you said.
I'm wondering if anyone has questions in the audience at this point, since we have about 10 minutes left. I did want to leave a little space here in case somebody was missing something. We went on a lot of different tracks here. And people may want to read a little bit more about her in the article that you did for the Nomadic Journal, which I'll put a link up to, so that, I'm sorry about this cat tail. It's just really
great
moving away.
Well, one of the things as we're waiting to see if some questions come in, one of the things that Antoinette and I also talked about was, why it was that Brigham, who was pretty well known at her time, was kind of forgotten. And we talked a little bit about how she defined herself, maybe didn't always self-identify solely as a designer. But also I think it is that big gap between thrift and design, right? Between craft and design. The idea that while we could look at what she designed today and really see the mind of a very incisive and thoughtful designer who thought about everything from production and material to mass manufacturing to the public, some might have just written her off as a do-gooder who created crafts for people to make at home, that she wasn't necessarily understood or revered for really the cleverness of what she did. And Antoinette,
and to add on to that, another facet of that is that not only were women not centered in any of these histories until quite recently, in the 1920s, design as a field got very interested in efficiency and those slick surfaces that we associate with the later 1920s. But efficiency, and you start having really big mass-produced furniture and other design objects. And efficiency, what she was doing was nothing to do with efficiency, except in the green sense that she's recycling packing crates into something else, a kind of bricolage effect. But it's not efficient in that fancy industrial sense that you get in the 1920s. So I think she sort of fell out of the conversation because she was interested in the handmade, and it was very hard to transfer. I think she didn't make the leap, and that I think she was simply the design conversation passed her by at a certain point.
Well, and didn't you say, Antoinette, that she furnished her entire apartment in box furniture for, like, at the time, a little over $1 something, which today would be what you estimated, like $600?
$4.
How much?
I think it was only about $100, maybe a little bit more. It was very, very little. She emphasizes how cheap it was in all of her writing. And one of the details I love that came up in one of the articles is that she disassembled the packing crates into units that she would then build back up into the furniture. But on some of them, she left the labels that said this was a tin can box or whatever underneath the furniture in hidden areas, because people would come to their apartment and see this beautiful furniture and not believe that it was made from packing crates. And that was one of the ways she could demonstrate, yeah, look, it's a packing crate. I just love that detail. That's clever thinking.
This makes me think about pallets in Los Angeles and the way we have these, that's the kind of equivalent, I think, of that raw wood. You have pallets that are rated A, B, or C, depending on the quality of the wood. How those could be refigured into different utility items, I think, could be an interesting challenge for a group of young
There's a world of people.
Here's a question from Jake.
There's a world of people making that work. The answer is no. Sadly, very, very little of her work has survived. No physical pieces that I've been able to find anywhere. There are really only photographs of the work from its own time. And that's another reason for obscurity. The stuff has to survive in order to be thought about by later generations of curators. And this is the general problem with what's generally called folk or vernacular furniture. It's used to death, and you don't have many copies in museums. So as far as I know, but the thing is, I don't know for certain that nothing survived. I haven't found any.
Do you know if anybody, can we set a challenge for people to go and look at the box furniture book and recreate her designs? I'm not talented enough, although Louise would say
I'd like to
read her book.
Yeah,
I'd actually like to do a show or a project where I challenged some designers to do exactly that, to make her furniture and maybe update it very slightly, to think as a designer about the furniture. I think that could be a very interesting project. I also wanted to note that when you were talking about the Katrina housing and some of the other ways in which architects are thinking about housing on scale, she was much more systematic in her thinking about how to build out of recycled materials. People have been building out of recycled materials forever. One thing here, one thing there. Turning it into a kind of entire program where you can build modules out of modules and sort of organize and understand it as a process strikes me as a kind of design thinking that is worth recognizing in her oeuvre.
Her work often reminds me a bit of what Sam Mockbee was doing at the Rural Studios in Hale County, Alabama. And if you're not familiar with Sam Mockbee's work, it really was that same idea of how do you build well for people who don't have the capacity to access a designer or an architect. And when it was under Mockbee's direction, they very much used, they would use a lot of recycled materials. For instance, those floor tiles that were popular for a while and may still be the rug pieces. Like there were a bunch of off-casts that weren't used that they used in a house. They used old, car windshields. And it really was very much about how you took what was in the immediate environment that was cast off and you start to repurpose it in such a way that it could make a home. And then after he left, the director at the time got very much into Antoinette that idea of, well, how do you scale this? How do you not just do an individual's home, but how do you create like a $10,000 home that you might be able to mimic across the country very easily.
Yeah. I think she would have been very much in tune with what started to happen in architecture starting in the 1960s. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say the Earth ship.
Sort of
the Earth ship.
Yeah, the Earth ship. I was going to say also, speaking of this, sorry, I've lost the thought. Something based on Elizabeth's thoughts about this kind of design. No, gone.
Well, I wanted to invite one or two more questions.
Oh, I know.
Comments. Oh, good. Sorry.
While a question's coming, I just wanted to say one of the things I found myself thinking a lot about when writing about Brigham was all of the unknown designers who do things like have designed ships, because ships with their tight spaces and need for utility above all are a place of where very interesting kinds of design have happened over many centuries, and most of those people are not known to design history either. There's great design out there that has never had a name attached to it. That looks like a question for Elizabeth more than for me.
You know, that's a great question. I don't know if I have a great answer. So well, everyone can see it. So why do so many mid-century designs, notably the Eames, incorporate low-cost materials such as plywood? That's a great question that I'm not as excelled in answering because, but what I can say is, you know, there was an ethos to the modernist movement in terms of the form and function of how a home should work and the relationship that the space should have with the individual. And I think that the Eameses in particular were really interested in like quotidian and pedestrian materiality. Like they weren't always looking to work in more expensive material. They were really interested in the ways in which you could take something as simple as plywood and apply it. And I think they also loved the prototyping capabilities that came from materials like that. There was a lot of iteration in their work and a lot of playing around. And one of the things that's really interesting now as you're thinking about mid-century design is there was also sort of this relationship to the way people use space. And one of the things that's come up is, you know, there's a mid-century home in the Savoy that had the sink right in the middle of the hallway. And this idea now is, in our pandemic, people are talking about this idea of bringing that back, that now we need to actually think about this idea of like, it seems so odd to see the sink in the middle of a hallway, almost the way you walk into a church and there's the holy water, right? But it's this idea of, you know, coming in and sort of that transition of cleansing and moving into the home. And it's interesting to see a lot of people have talked about how we need to bring that pedestal sink back into the hallway now.
You know, that reminds me of something also, Elizabeth. I'm sorry, I'll say just one quick thing. There in Brigham's book, she has an entire design for a room she calls the invalid's room, which struck me because that's not what most people would design for a house now. You know, there's master bedroom and playroom, all kinds of things, but there's not an invalid's room. And it reminded me how many people were ill in the first part of this century because of all of the digestive diseases, intestinal diseases, and all the different kinds of things. But she was thinking about an invalid's room.
You know, it's interesting because, and this brings us back to today, you know, right now what's happening in a lot of ways is that there's sort of this vanguard of designers who are thinking very much about, rather than thinking about a space as a set of parts, like a kit of parts, you start to think about the way humans really function in the space and what we need it for. That I think as all of us spend more time at home, we're probably starting to appreciate the nuances of a space more. We're noticing things more. I certainly have noticed my home in new ways that I had not appreciated before. And one of those is this idea that we have these different moments of emotive states. So sometimes we're sick, we're invalids. Sometimes we're needing to be more contemplative. And we so much designed for so long for outcome or for purpose, rather than for the emotion that might be happening in the space, or the need of the human being in the space, that there really is this interesting shift with some architects who are using this neuroarchitecture, is what they're calling it, and neuroaesthetics, which is, you know, very much this idea of how do you start to design again with the human at the center, knowing that we're these malleable, changing beings with different needs and moods, and what might that look like, rather than saying kitchen, dining room. I mean, obviously the bathroom has to stay pretty much as it is, because are there any movements towards the increased needs? You know, I think that there are definitely movements where people are trying to source locally, in the same way that you're seeing those small movements of, you know, farm to table, locally sourced foods. The challenge, of course, is that we've gotten so far away from it. We're so far removed from being able to, in a large way in our design and construction and development world, you know, honor local resources. It's such a globalized marketplace. It'll be interesting to see what happens as the pandemic disrupts global, potentially global, you know, material movement. But, you know, there are small pockets of architects thinking about this idea of how to create a less, you know, a more local design source. And of course, you know, now we're living in an area of 3D printing, you know? Yeah, and then Frank Lloyd Wright's Talesian in Scottsdale. Yep, and also out that way there is Arco Sante, the that other artist, Solaric, also had his place out in the desert that was very much about relearning that skill. There are some interesting architects that have been doing work primarily in places like Africa and elsewhere, where they're training, similar to what Frank Lloyd Wright was talking about in Scottsdale, where they're training a new workforce to like be able to create their own brick, to be able to mine their own material and try and build from what's there. And there's a couple of interesting projects I can think of that I could maybe link to that speak to that. But I'm not, you know, I don't know how.
Elizabeth?
Yeah.
I have a question for you on that front. It seems to me that most of the time when I read about locally sourced materials, I'm reading about some expensive one-off house that somebody is, again, with a lot of money, is building in a nice rural area because they can, and it's about design for the wealthy. I'm thinking that this is not necessarily an area where the United States is going to be leading. It does, like you're saying, it sounds like we do not still give enough thought to how we design for people who are not well off.
Yeah, I think that's really true, and I think that you know, there's also an interesting question that just came in about, you know, our building code, and you certainly do run into an issue in the United States in particular with building codes, with zoning. You know, here in Baltimore, where I live, for years, I lived in an 1840s stone mill house that was built from the stone quarried in the river valley. And, you know, there was a time that we were building from that material and the heart pine wood. But you realize that increasingly we've moved to this very large mass movement of material. And as we moved into sustainability, oftentimes that can move into a technological conversation about material type that's man-made, that is meant to be more efficient. And so there's been a lot of like cladding in houses that that is manufactured with the idea that it's more sustainable. You know, there's also someone like Justin Timberlake out of Philadelphia, the firm Kieran Timberlake, which does really fascinating work if you're not familiar with them. And they definitely have looked into how to source more locally and how to build with material that makes sense for the environment. And they did a great house out here in Maryland called the Loblolly House, which was this interesting combination of sort of a prefabbed, think of like cut to shape off-site, brought to the site, and then built in a lot of ways, you know, what Brigham was trying to do with her furniture. And they very much have been thinking about this pipeline of how to work within building codes, how to work honestly within the construction industry, which is very regulated and very comfortable with 2-bys and with sheetrock. And I see a question about the tiny house movement. What do you two think about the tiny house movement?
Mm-hmm. I'll just say quickly that it's something I've been interested in since I first heard about it, 2 decades ago now. But I see that the tiny house people are working within a constraint. Just like Brigham's working within the constraint of the urban tenement apartment, the tiny house people are working within the constraint of the building codes that they have to be a certain size in order to be allowable. They have to be a certain width to be transportable. Like everything, it's like this cage that they need. You can't fix society as a whole, but you can look for clever hacks within the existing situation. So I do think that I've seen a number of tiny house projects which are doing a great job with local sourcing and even setting up so it's, you know, scrapable later with minimal damage to the environment.
I think that's
placed. Yeah.
I think it really does come down to price too. Like right now, we're just at a place where cost, even in the tiny house movement, it's so expensive, some of these kits, and it's just not conceivable. And so I think we're still in kind of this bespoke and precious place with it. But what I think is positive is that there is a real desire by many people to reconsider what their needs are in terms of space. And I think that that's a positive. So the question is, can we start to understand how to systemically make that easier and more affordable, and not just like, you know, a precious Dwell magazine article, but something that feels viable for people.
I think a lot of more honesty around cost would be helpful. One of the things I've noticed, I think probably everyone has, with these shelter magazines and places like Dwell, they will never tell you the actual cost of one of these projects. And so they allow people to fantasize that they too could build or own something like that. But also people should be aware of the cost of building, and then there's a cost of not building, which is what we're facing in Los Angeles County with 60,000 homeless people. We have the cost of not building housing. And I think one of the things that's going to be very interesting over the next decade is if the idea of housing as a right really gains traction in this country, that could be a game changer. I think it should be a right. I feel very strongly about that.
Well, and this has been like a conversation, of course, for a while, and I'm forgetting his name now, and I can't believe I'm forgetting it. Bill McDonough, was it? No. Who did it? It was back in the 90s. It was the cradle to cradle idea of materiality. Is like, how do you use something from its conception to its end, and you keep reusing it in the building system? And, you know, that was wrapped into some sustainability conversations. And it's interesting because one of the things that's striking, though, is as we're talking about like building codes, is that we will build buildings and call them sustainable. We'll give them a rating from like an organization like LEED. We'll certify the building as platinum or gold, and maybe you've seen these certifications, but we give that to the building before human beings operate inside of it. And so I think we've been sort of channeled into technology and material and not into the way humans are actually functioning. So for instance, at the New York Times new green building, they have automatic shades that come down to protect against solar gain coming in from the south-facing sun. And the idea is if you block the sun, you don't create heat gain in the building. Well, people wanted the sunshine, so they created these hacks to like put books up against the shades so that the shades wouldn't block their sun, right? And what we don't have right now in the built environment is we don't have what's known as post-occupancy studies. There are very few clients who are willing to let architects or others come back in and say, how well is this building really functioning now that people are in? Because the way human beings operate, I mean, that's the undoing of any kind of best sustainable design sometimes, is that we're going to always stack the books against the automatic shade to get our natural sunlight. Dennis on the comments mentions Michael Reynolds, and I'll admit I do not know who Michael Reynolds is. So I don't know if Dennis wants to give us a little. William McDonough, yes, thank you. Cradle to Cradle.
Yes, thank you. Yes. Thanks, Melinda. Carrie, you think about architecture a lot too. What are your thoughts about where we are now?
Oh, yeah. I was just looking up Michael Reynolds, building school. I mean, this guy looks fascinating. I'll put his Earthship logo.
Great, thank you.
For people.
Oh, yes.
So if you wanted to check this out on the side on another browser tab or something. But, you know, all this conversation has made me think of two things that are, I think, probably, you know, if we say housing is a right and that eventually comes to pass in a legal way and we get through this horrible, it's a pandemic of homelessness that's happening around the country. There's a bridge in there that I found really interesting, looking at people who are living in cars and living in mobile homes. Some people are doing this, of course, because they're surfers and they want to be independent. They want to go drive around and camp and then surf all day and then just have their little home and rent their other thing out to someone else and get the cash. That's one version. The other version is people who've decided they are aging, they cannot afford their home anymore, and their option is to go live in their car. And how do you make your used, your 10-year-old sedan comfortable for yourself and your little dog as a woman in her 70s to live out the rest of her life? And I've seen there's an amazing guy on YouTube that's doing interviews with people in campsites, and he is also of this movement. He has a name for it. That's really, it's not homelessness. It's this idea of taking control of your life. I'll think of it, and I'll try to think of it before I'm finished here. But there's a lot of design that goes into how do you build a toilet into the back seat of your car? How do you create these layers of functionality so that you can have your kitchen and you can have your bed and you can actually sleep properly? And how can you be safe? And how do you have your pet with you? Because a lot of people are in cars because they don't want to be in shelters because they have a pet. That's a design challenge right there. And I think Louise Brigham's kind of ideas about thrift, they really suit that moment where there is a real need for thinking outside the box about how you want to live in a circumstance that you wouldn't have chose. You need to respect people who are taking up that kind of design challenge, and people like this wonderful guy on YouTube who's spreading the message in a way to other people to give them hope. Hey, this can be a positive experience for you. You're going to be living in your car or your van. Here, let's talk to this person. They came up with this, innovative idea. This person, did this for less money. This person is having a nice time because they made this little innovation. So,
I think I think what's really interesting about what you're bringing up is there's been a paucity of imagination for how we house ourselves in America. We've always, of course, been a culture of homeownership, right? And primarily of white homeownership, because that was the way that the development was structured. There's a couple of really interesting books that have come out in the last few years that talk about the ways in which we prioritized home ownership, the way we designed in for some people and designed out for others, and of course, frankly, the racist and bigoted policies that from the 1800s on meant that if you were Black or if you were Jewish or if you were whatever, like, you weren't allowed to buy into these homes. And in Baltimore, where I live, we're still obviously feeling the ripple effect of this very closed idea of what home is and who's allowed to have that home. And there's a new book by a historian named Paige Glotzer that examines this whole history. And I can put a link to her book up if you're interested in this kind of thing, because it really looks at real estate development, how it fed into zoning, how it fed into building codes, how it fed into even mass transit, and the ways in which restricted covenants and redlining and all of these things created a system in which we weren't able to not only be thoughtful about housing, but we created housing only for like a minority of people in our country. But I think that it's really interesting because I think we do have to get more creative and more thoughtful about what it looks like to house ourselves right now, right?
And bring in people who are designing on the fly, who aren't necessarily designers by training, but designers by necessity.
Yeah.
Those people have a lot to offer the field of design burgeoning in the 21st century that needs to be sustainable, green, more equitable, more affordable, all of those things, more humane.
Well, and right now that is it's interesting because where you're seeing that happening as well is, in these businesses that are trying to reopen safely and there's no guidance. So there's a lot of hacks right now where people are trying to figure out how to create safe spaces on the fly, on their own, without, a larger connection to a design community in that regard. There was a question about energy and water offset in innovation and design. And yeah, I mean, when a project, particularly commercially, but I think even in private housing as well, there really are ways that, if you're trying to get, for instance, a certification for a sustainable building, there absolutely is a water component. So, there very much is a whole kind of checklist of energy saving remedies, and water is a big one. And I think that there's been a lot of understanding right now that fresh water and water usage is really high on the list of what we need to think about, and that water in buildings is particularly an issue, and fresh water. And so, yes, water has been a huge conversation, not only in how to preserve what exists and use less of it, but also, of course, in global warming and rising sea levels, and the ways in which you contain the water from the outside from coming in.
Hi, I'm just going to add a link to this guy in the RV. You might get a Biden ad, unfortunately, or something else. But it's called RV living or something like that. But if you Google, YouTube living in my car, you'll find this guy who's going around interviewing people. This one is today we meet D, who's doing blah 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 for $800.
Yeah.
So
does Lead go far enough? So I don't think it does. I think Lead was valuable and success in in its inception and in its desire to try and quantify the ways in which you could make a building more sustainable. But in a lot of cases, unless you sign on for a continued relationship with LEED, you don't have to necessarily do the post-occupancy study to see if the building is functioning in the way in which you think it will by using these materials. So there's been a lot of conversation about, greenwashing, this idea that sustainability has very much become a marketing term that's very important to people, and people will talk about, how green their building is. And, again, I wrote a piece that I'll try and find. It's on my website. This was a few years ago now, about all right, we're about a decade in to LEED. What are we finding about the buildings that are coming out of it? And by and large, you were finding that it was really only a handful of really savvy and committed folks who had a long-term relationship in understanding that the building was a living, breathing thing that they needed to keep on top of, that we're really seeing the kinds of metrics that really make a difference in terms of energy usage and water usage. I mean, another example I love was the GSA, which is the federal government's sort of architecture body that looks over all of the sort of federal buildings. They were trying to go green, and their own office they upgraded, and they put these task lights on all of the desks that were motion sensitive. So if you weren't using it and you weren't there, they were supposed to turn off. The idea was how do you help human beings who forget to turn off their lights? But then what would happen is the first person who walked in the morning would walk past all the desks, and every single light would turn on. It's just this, it was an intention that was meant to be good, but then when humans got involved, it kind of messed up. So I think really, unless we're doing post-occupancy study to understand how the material is working, I don't know if it does go far enough. Try and find that article.
I can say anecdotally that on my campus, UC Irvine, the art school has what I think is one of the first of the campus's LEED certified buildings, if not the first. And it has a lot of issues that go directly to livability, dark corridors and cold, sort of a sense of physical coldness that makes you not want to be in the building. And no place to sit down, like no cozy corners. This has been a complaint for me forever about public buildings in general, that there's no place to just sit down and be quiet for 5 minutes. I find myself sitting on the floor because there's nowhere to sit down without having to walk to an office or walk to a cafe or something. Something that simple has always struck me as ridiculous. But I've also was thinking about how both LEED and Passive House, the Passive House standard from Europe, are very rigid, and people are actually backing off those and looking for things that are kind of compromises that might be more doable, while we're all still trying to hack what a sustainable building, a livable sustainable building, really looks like for the next 100 or 2 years. I've come across something called the Pretty Good House, which is an American response to Passive House. Like, seriously, most people are not going to buy, who can afford a house, are not going to build Passive House, but Pretty Good gets you a long way along the path. That's one kind of an approach. And then I also have been reading about how Sweden has automated, to go back to automation, has done some much better job with automating some of this modular stuff to bring the cost down and doing it with wood. Now, I don't know how sustainable all that is, but they have, given that what we need is a lot of lower cost housing in America right now, we should be looking at models like that in order to try to create infill in places where housing is needed. It's not like Americans do. We do have this terrible idea that we have to invent everything and not ever look outside our borders for ideas.
Well, there was an interesting statistic. I think it was by a study by the EPA that, well, this is pre-pandemic, that said, we spend 75% of our time indoors, and the other 10% is in a car or a bus. So when you think about it, we're spending the majority of our life in human-made environments, right? And it's interesting, I mentioned a little bit about this before, but there was a fascinating exhibition that was done at the Milan Furniture Fair a year or two ago that was run by a Hopkins lab here called the Arts and Minds Lab, and by Google, by a woman at Google. And so it was called A Space for Being. And the whole idea was they took 3 different room designs, and they had a little measurement, like a biofeedback measurement. And the idea was to see like how different volume and shape and textile and lighting, like each room had sort of a theme, made you feel like and the goal was to see where did you feel the most calm. And each room was very different, but it had the same furniture company made all the furniture, so that it was taking out some of those variables. But Antoinette, it goes to your point about how we require different things for different states of mind. And that oftentimes our work environments are designed for productivity, not for contemplation that you're talking about, or they're designed for sustainability, but the sustainability isn't taking in mind the human comfort factor. Or, right now we're finally realizing that open floor office plans are actually chaotic for many people and the acoustics don't work. And so it's very interesting because you can't, again, going back to Brigham, you can't remove the human being from the built environment and expect it to be successful, because, then it's all of us sort of moving about spaces that are uncomfortable.
Yeah, I love with Brigham how she...
We have an interesting question.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, can I just jump in and say that I love with Brigham how she incorporated the bookcases into lots of different things. There's a bookcase in the side of a chair, a bookcase at the end of a bed. This idea that, well, these are places that you might go to relax that have multi-purpose. And the bookcase seems to be, that's the kind of early 20th century idea about contemplation, relaxation, introspection, feeling good, transportation to a different mental realm. And so they're kind of like symbolic parts of her design, which I see could be done in a lot of different ways now. That thing, whatever that is, that's tucked there, if you have a chair it unrolls into a yoga mat, like that would be a kind of example of a 21st century version of that.
Yeah, and I think that really, in the same way that Brigham thought about the universal, like the whole, and also the individual, part of it is just, I think, can we wake up to our own bodies in space? Can we start to
biometrics?
Yeah,
without having a computer tell us you're relaxed now.
Exactly. And so really the goal of that exhibition was that whole moment of people tuning in and realizing, oh, I realized that one room had the scent of charcoal and this other room had the scent of verbena, and that really changed how I felt about the room. The idea that, like, why do you have your favorite coffee mug that you love to hold? Why do you have the preferred pen? Even these little things, which again, the detail that Brigham had about the comfort of a pillow, the beauty of a textile, really wasn't just about, the frivolity of beauty. It was that we are emotive, sensory beings, that we are very much affected on every level by the smell and the sound and the texture, and that there are these things like the bookshelf or the chair in the corner that mean a lot to all of us. But I think there's something really interesting in, kind of waking up to what space does for us and taking more autonomy, perhaps, in how we think about what we have around us and what it does to our well-being.
I have to say that was one of the things that I felt a kinship with Brigham, because she had bookshelves everywhere in every piece of furniture she built. It's almost laughable. I'm somebody who builds basically every room around my bookshelves. So I felt that it was very something I had in common with her. Another thing, I looked at kind of what a lot of her designs were. She did a lot of desks and tables. She really had this idea that you had to have a place where you could lay something out and work on it, do something with it. Maybe it would be a table that would be a desk in the morning and a school desk for the kids, and then later on you would do your writing there. But she really did believe that there was certain furniture she spent a lot more time thinking about than others.
It's a great comment, Jake.
Yeah. I wanted to just address this question about color because, interior designer didn't really exist as a profession when Brigham was really working on her ideas. Interior decorator was just beginning to become a. There were, for every room that she designed in the book, she came up with a color palette for it. So that again, to go back to Elizabeth's point, the colors in the den and the library were calming colors. The living room had brighter, kind of more spark of good conversation colors. The kitchen had colors that could stand a little dirt because the stoves of the time were very sooty and the kitchens were generally, I think, hard to clean. So she was very aware of color as a and I think that comes from her training as an artist in part. Color is a key to each room.
And like Finnish designers like Alvo Aalto, he understood in that cold environment, he would do like a yellow palette on stairs with a warm wood rail. And the idea that the natural wood and the yellow would make you feel warmer, would give you the perception of feeling warmer. He intuited, that sort of physical response that you would have in that relationship to color. And of course, we could have a whole other 2 hours on color, right? Like, and its use in the built environment. There was the question about Michael Graves. With other advantages of providing accessible designed products to the masses, other than providing cheap but nice looking furniture? I think, and Dennis, chime in if I'm not getting this correct, but meaning that Graves obviously has been very sensitive to designing products that are usable by everybody, right? That, and this is something that I have thought a lot about over my career as well, which is design for aging, which is to say that we're getting older, we're living longer, or we were, and that, that is a question of sustainability, right? This idea that we need those products that can be used by a hand that might be arthritic, that we have what are known as zero threshold houses, because one of the biggest issues for us as we get older is tripping and falling. And some of actually most fascinating, I think, examples of ways people have been rethinking housing have been in the design for aging realm or in the accessible design realm, which is that, for instance, in New York, they now have this thing called NORCs, which are known as naturally occurring retirement communities, where they have a building that is primarily filled with people at post-retirement or older, and they've effectively created their own community system within which they get services brought in and provided that help them manage and facilitate staying at home, but having what they need without having to go to a retirement community. And so there's been some really interesting, creative thought about how you might age in place and age well, and thinking about how design can better facilitate that. Like, now there's communities designed around Alzheimer's and adult autism or spectrum, where what kind of body do you get there in?
This is a book by someone I know who's
these are great things.
She was actually a former studio mate, and she had a child with Down syndrome, and so then she spent the last 15 years looking at design solutions for people with different levels of ability in different ways. So she just published this book. I'm waiting for my copy. It just came out. Not to put another book into this.
No, it's great.
Here we've got so many references in this chat, but it's good to have the references in the chat because everybody that has a link that came into this can come back anytime and get to the chat or copy the chat. So anyway, that idea of thinking about different bodies inhabiting spaces and what the moral obligation really of the designer is to think through all of those questions. So I think, Dennis's point about the advantages of cost, it's maybe it's less about that and more about like cost over the lifetime of a person's interaction with the design. Like, it's worth investing more in something that's going to age with you, or it's worth investing more in something that's going to do 3 things instead of just one. That kind of idea. So it seems like that multifunctionalism was definitely part of Louise Brigham's thought process when she's looking at designing for small spaces and modular systems that become modular in a meta way, modules then become other modules. And I'm looking, we actually they're going to kick us off in 8 minutes. So I think anybody who has, if they still want to ask, definitely put it in the chat. I think, providing something artful. Yeah, I agree, Dennis. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I was reading somewhere today about, someone on Twitter saying something, basically, just like we talk about the tiny house movement, and it's like, over here, we're holding up this couple that is living out of a shipping container, but over here, we're vilifying the person living in a trailer. And that there's this, again, this gap between, and this irony between how we're reading those spaces because of who is living inside and how much they earn. And
the idea of camping versus setting up a tent in the park because you have nowhere else to go.
Yeah.
Family vacation camping versus necessity camping.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember that one of the things Brigham did toward the end of her career was to design a line of camping furniture once again made out of recycled materials for inner city boys who didn't get to go to the country very much. And she actually took them on at least one expedition. There's photographs from it. And she called it the take apart furniture, which it looks to be a trademark she registered. So I think she actually was thinking in terms of multiple assembly and disassembly, which is of course something that's been a feature of camping and military furniture for a very long time. So I suspect she was just beginning to explore the idea that something might be disassemblable and then reassemblable in a useful way. The idea of furniture itself being portable, which wasn't a feature really of any of her other furniture so far as I know. She built it to last, not to be dismountable.
Well, and it's interesting because now we're doing.
So I think.
I was going to say, now it's like, again, we're living at a time where we're doing these very few and far between social distanced gatherings where we might meet a few friends and everyone's bringing their own chair because we're not, we're kind of moving and bringing things with us because we're not going into each other's homes right now. Yeah.
That might be a good place to leave it because we've had such a great virtual gathering from people. I know people are, the death of the love seat. That's very funny.
I love that.
I hope people take something away from this. It is just like an actionable item. Maybe either of you have a suggestion. If there's one place in your home or in your life that you would look to, what could people concentrate on leading this conversation to think about design for their own lives? What are some places that are real nexus for us?
I'm going to just speak personally and say I think one of the upticks to the weirdness of our world right now is that I found myself looking at my home not for the way I see it through other people's eyes. Like now that guests aren't coming over, or I'm seeing my home more for the way we really truly use it. And so I feel, and I'm noticing spaces that are underused or perhaps ornamental, like the death of the love seat could be the title of our new design book. Is that I feel like it maybe feeling empowered to look at the way in which you're really using your space, the way you really are interacting with it, and what that means, and having that freedom to sort of let go of the other expectation or this idea of like what happens when company comes over. It's helped me really think differently about my home. Yeah.
I've noticed that because I don't leave the house for 12 hours every day, which is basically how my job life worked back when I could go to a job, I'm aware of every little space in a way I wasn't before, because I'm spending just so much more time here, and I'm aware of how, in a way, I don't have a very big house, right? But so everything has to be in a way multifunctional already. I don't think about rooms as bespoke rooms, like this is the living room, this is the dining room. They're all living areas where I do more of one thing than another. And so there's a way in which it isn't just about taking partitions down. It's maybe partly a way of not obsessing about what a room is supposed to be. Like let your rooms be taken over by whatever you want to do in them, and then call that the room, right? It's like the principle of gardening, where whatever survives is what you're supposed to have in your garden. Rather than trying to force yourself to have, like I did when I first started gardening, East Coast flowers here in Southern California. Very few of them did well. So you can do it. You can put a lot of energy into making some of those flowers survive here, but there's a kind of a joy in letting your own living style turn your house inside out. I don't have really a dining room table, because I don't eat at a dining room table the way normal people do unless there's company. So what I have is another work table that I can clear off as needed. Everybody has something in their house that they're just keeping for other people, and they don't really need it, maybe.
So I want to thank everybody for coming. We are unfortunately limited to 2 hours on the broadcast, so we've got about 60 seconds left. Thank you both so much for being here, and I will put up any more information that you have. I can add it to the chat later, so we can kind of have this as a record. And then this talk will also be on YouTube and will be on the Nomadic Journal under Antoinette's adaptation, with some new information that's not in the book, but an adaptation from the book.
Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you so much. It was really great to see you both, Elizabeth and Antoinette, and everybody else in the room. Thank you.
It was really fun to talk to you guys. And thank you for coming, everybody who came, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you for writing the book, Antoinette.
Yes, thanks, Antoinette.
It was great. Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
It was a lot of fun, I gotta say. Try it. Bye. Bye, y'all.